Hello, Senator Francis.
Hello, Pia. Good afternoon.
I only see the two senators here. So that means magpapakain si Senator Bato. Okay. Sige, anyway, so this is a continuation of our hearing our hearing last Tuesday. We're very happy that we have a continuation today, so we can hear more and learn more about futures thinking. Just to recall, we started listening to our resource persons on what futures thinking is all about and the different ways of applying it in different aspects of society. So we have more of our resource persons present today. I will call on them, but I just want to acknowledge. Okay, it's a long list. I don't think I can acknowledge everyone present. Let me just go straight into the materials then. So ready to present is Mr. Joss Wagner on the Change Initiative. And then after that, we will have the Development Academy, but I'll allow my colleagues to ask some question and answers later on. And we also still have our resource persons from last Tuesday in case you have follow-up questions, and they're also welcome to interject comments and observations in the course of the discussion. So with that, let me call on Mr. Joss Wagner.
Thank you, Senator Pia. Do you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm happy to be the first today to, because I think it's complementary what our two colleagues, Dr. Suhail and our colleagues from Finland presented last time. So I try to be brief. I see a lot of people today in the call. So I'm sure there's a lot of discussion going on. So before I start, I just wanted to congratulate you to actually having a committee on SDGs, innovation and future thinking. As you can hear from my accent, I'm originally German, but I'm based in Thailand for the last 16 years and in Asia 20 years. So I haven't come across a committee like that in the German parliament ever. So I think that's an excellent initiative. Congratulations to the senators who are part of this committee. So just to, I sent a presentation. Is it possible to share that also today, or?
Yes, it is possible. Do you have the means to upload it yourself, or yeah, it's there.
Yes. Okay. So I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts, and I come from a maybe slightly different complementary perspective. Maybe just to understand where I come from, I'm a professional facilitator. So I work with all the organizations who work on SDGs, the United Nations, the GIZ, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank. And about 6 years ago, I turned to future thinking because I felt we have to maybe, how do you say that, increase our capacity to look further into the future if we want to change it. And so since then, I use a lot of future thinking tools in my facilitation practice. And in the workshops, I usually facilitate on behalf of these organizations, are politicians, parliamentarians, secretaries of state, sometimes even ministers, and we are trying to work on the future. So I'm very close to Dr. Suhail. We are both on the core group of the Asia Pacific Futures Network. I will say something about that in a second. So so I use all the tools also my futurist colleagues use, but there is a slight difference. As a facilitator and future thinking practitioner, I use everybody's knowledge in the meeting. So I'm less a person who would actually make any predictions or so in my workshops, we use the collective wisdom, the collective knowledge and energy of everybody to create better futures. So as our Finnish colleague said last time, we are living in a VUCA world. So they already have elaborated on that. And I think since 2008, since the global financial crisis, I think this term has become very popular because of the turbulence, the dangers, the unpredictability of in certain areas. So I think with the COVID-19, this has increased even more. And many of my workshops, some of them happened actually this week, were all about post-COVID. And so many of the people in the workshop see COVID-19 not only as a threat and a disruption in the way we live, they see it also as an opportunity to create better futures. So so many of us in the futures field actually look probably at 3 horizons. So I guess many of you as policymakers look at how the future unfolds in the next months or 1 or 2 years. I think Senator Pia mentioned last time you had to leave for a Senate hearing on budgeting. So if you work with UN organizations, they often want to think about 1 year or 3 years because that's how long often programs work. Then, of course, there's Horizon 2, where we look maybe like 5 to 8 or 5 to 10 years. I think our colleagues from Finland on the future radar, many of you saw in the last meeting, I think there was a 2028. And then, of course, there's Horizon 3, where we look maybe into the very long future. So that's maybe the next generation. I think Dr. Suhail was also talking about 2050, and you might be aware of his book of 2038. So that's a long view. So one of the tricky parts in any approach I wanted to highlight is again, and this is actually a slogan from a Futures Institute I'm familiar with in the US. They use also this foresight, insight. So we all learned a lot about what, for example, the future radar can do. So, and I think also it might have been Senator Bartolo de la Rosa. I think it's all about that we need insights, and then we of course have to act on what we hear. So very often we stop with the information, we're doing foresight, but then we are pretty poor on the insights and sometimes even poorer on the action. So if we want to change our attitudes, behaviors, and decisions, action has to happen, right? So this is just a reminder that knowledge or information is not enough. So one way of doing it is, of course, actually having these kind of participatory workshops where we actually generate these insights and also get a consensus on the action. So Dr. Suhail and I, we touched base before Tuesday. So I just wanted to maybe share a little bit how the Futures Committee starts increasingly engage with the policymakers in the region. So this is the picture of the 2019 Asia Pacific Futures Network, which I hosted in 18 and 19. You can see already the environment is a little bit unusual because we were collaborating with the National Innovation Agency of Thailand, as well as Ananda Development. That's actually the second biggest construction company in Thailand. However, they are also the host of the Singularity University. So if you're familiar with Silicon Valley, they also have an initiative where they think about the future, often from a very technical point of view, but it's called Singularity University. So they were all partnering in this exercise, and we had a lot of policymakers coming. And I saw someone on the call from NEDA. We had also colleagues from NEDA. We had advisors to the president of Indonesia, the advisor to the president or prime minister of Armenia, and so on and so on. They are not necessarily futurists. They just had a preliminary knowledge, but they engage in conversations with the experts, and a lot of initiatives and energy was taken from this interaction between these kind of people. And so the Futures Network is only 5 years old, and it has become really a platform once a year where we meet face to face. The next one was supposed to be hosted by Malaysia under the leadership of the Deputy Prime Minister. However, of course, you can imagine that this has been postponed. So we don't know yet exactly when. The Asian Development Bank also started partnering with us. And so we hope that this year, we hope we can do it this year or at the beginning of next year. Let's see. So how do we engage with the policymakers? One way, and this is initiative I started 5 years ago together with Dr. Suhail. We are running courses with policymakers, decision makers, bring them together with other stakeholders or interested parties, also from the private sector. And so one way, for example, the Future Thinking initiative in the Asian Development Bank, I think Senator Pia is very much aware of that, has started was actually bringing over a couple of interested people from the ADB, and then they became so much interested that they're actually now hosting their own futures workshops and conferences, but mainly workshops in different countries, often up to Senate, not only Senate level, but actually they had a couple of meetings where they managed to get minister level into the room. So this is, of course, great when the leadership gets an exposure to future thinking. So, and you're not just informed, but you become part of the process. Because without you people, there not much will happen, right? Because you are working on the laws of the country and you can bring things forward. Another poster here is actually Singapore is maybe the best example in ASEAN. We have a lot of organizations working on future thinking. NUS is actually running a number of courses every year. And so also, as far as we know, a lot of senior decision makers in government have been exposed into future thinking, foresight. Some people use even the anticipatory thinking, or they actually call it futures literacy. And I think you don't have to become a futurist to do futures, but to have what you are doing right now with this commission, getting exposed to future thinking, is a fantastic step. Also, there is a lot of material, very practical. When I listen to and he's partly my Professor Suhail, I think if you're, sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming when you hear the first time future thinking, and some of the futurists might also have a problem, like many professors or many people, to speak in a simple language that everybody understands. However, there is a lot of good material available now, and also very practical stuff. So the UN, for example, has a foresight manual. The British government has a tool for future thinking and foresight. And I wanted to highlight a recent initiative also by the Asian Development Bank in Manila. They have actually gave a description of a couple of tools, as well as described a couple of workshops. I think it's for people who are more practical oriented, less the academic type, a very good reference to see how workshops would look like. And maybe 2 or 3 more final remarks. I think the best way to create a sustainable future is to create it together. As a facilitator, we say, if you want to change a system, bring the system in the room. I often see that we fall in the trap that we have this kind of academic style conferences. We have fantastic speakers. We do a Q&A, and then we wait for the magic to happen. I know you're all busy people, but if you can participate in future thinking workshops with other stakeholders, and then I think there's much more ownership, and the visions, the action plans you create are much more owned and much more realistic to be implemented. So when I said bring the system in the room, very often when workshops are organized, we have, unfortunately, there are important stakeholders missing. It was actually a point Dr. Suhail made actually yesterday with the example, I think it was about prison, or 2 days ago, about the prisons. So why don't you bring prison inmates when you talk about the futures of prison? If you talk, of course, about teachers, the future of education, you only need education specialists and teachers. You want to have the students, you want to have the parents, and so on and so on. So if you create these kind of workshops about the future, make sure all the stakeholders are represented. And maybe my last point I wanted to make is actually about the narratives Dr. Suhail also mentioned, and Dr. Pia, you also asked, I think your first question was about the power of narratives, and Dr. Suhail gave also my favorite example when you give, I think it was also from the security sector, in a workshop where police was given, one group was asked, crime is a beast, and the other group had crime is a virus, that their approaches was very different because they had different narratives, different images of the future. So I think now one image I personally see is, of course, seeing that that now our cities, and as I said, I live in Bangkok and I come very, very often to Manila, so that our cities are, or have been at least for a short while, very much free of smog. So I think, and even when I think it's quite famous satellite pictures of China, and I think many of you also have these apps on your phone where you can see the air quality. But the pictures actually show that that we have now live in a time where where cities can actually be free of smog. And Brussels just announced 2 days ago or 3 days ago new measures. Brussels was always behind in terms of ecological measures. They have taken away everywhere lanes for cars and introduced bicycle lanes without even informing the population very much, as a learning from COVID times. And another image I think that is very much popular in Europe, and it's on the picture here on the upper left, is actually in Italy, the people who are making music on the balconies. I'm sure you have your own local images of the future or that are related to post-COVID times. So, so if the virus can actually change our future, so maybe some people might say that the virus was just a messenger to do something differently. So maybe it was a message that our civilization has become too dense, too populated, too overheated, or racing too fast in a direction that is not sustainable. So I want to finish with a quote of a colleague. So it's time for a system reset, cool down, music on the balconies, and this is how the future works. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you very much for that, Joss. Dear colleagues, you can feel free to ask any questions, but let me also acknowledge Senator Marcos is also with us. So before I turn you over to another speaker, I'd like to remind everyone, especially those who were here last time, that Dr. Suhail is still with us, Dr. Tomo and Saku, who made their presentations just 2 days ago, and now Joss has also made his presentation. Just a question to all of you actually, so that we get the ball rolling, because we're going to go a little bit to the local side. What would be your experience in terms of how fast, number one, government officials versus students or academe, which group is faster to pick up on futures thinking, and how did you find it to be the most effective way to get futures thinking into the mindset of people? um I, what I'm trying to get at is, like, isn't a crisis the best time to get people into that mindset, given that we're already in one right now because of COVID? On the one hand, there's this urge to solve problems today in the now. But by way of example, my hearing a couple of hours ago, the Senate had a hearing on education. And of course, it's about adjusting, distance learning. But it's also the right time to start thinking, well, how do we make these adjustments for 5, 10, 20, 30 years from now? Because technically, if we had started planning 20 years ago, we could have been more prepared today. So just some insight on that from you, Joss, and our other resource person who have been with us for the last 2 sessions.
Do you want me to go first? Because I see my colleague from Finland, Dr. Suhail, is also in the call.
Yeah, any of you, well, you're speaking now, so go ahead.
Okay, so it's very difficult to say who is faster. Actually, my experiences, and I'm sure my colleagues have similar experiences, when we're conducting the trainings or we do these workshops, there is a group that comes out of the workshop completely inspired and want to run with it. And then we have people who are still where the head is buzzing and they are skeptical, because to think about the future is very uncomfortable for many people, right? And even a colleague from the ADB, who is a futurist herself, she said to me, in the moment I can think only 3 days ahead, and I had to laugh because she's a futurist, right? So, and then there are people, I would say, they don't want to stress themselves out with thinking about the future. So the way is usually how most change works is that there is a group of champions who goes ahead and hopefully pulls people with you. So my hope, of course, is that this committee, even with a name, future thinking in it, related to SDGs, which is a part of my being. So I think you will be the champions, and you can pull other senators who might hear you had this hearing with this strange group of futurists, or not so strange group of futurists, that they will follow you and maybe get engaged with you in various formats you can provide. Maybe I leave it there and let my colleague from Finland add on.
Yes, hi, this is Saku Koskinen from Finland. Hi, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. It's a great honor. Unfortunately, Dr. Tuomo Kuosa couldn't join today. He's actually working just as we speak with the Finnish Ministry of Transport and Communications. However, just to continue on my colleague Jost, I agree 100%. Like you said, it's definitely, it needs a champion, and what we have seen also, what really helps it and enables this futures thinking and the whole foresight practices is that if an organization has in place some kind of a system or process or method around the futures thinking and futures work, we've seen as a great benefit. And then, of course, people facilitating it, and it can be facilitated from the outside or inside. But any type of a methodology, and it doesn't need to be a complex process, and that really helps. And together that combined with communication, efficient communications, and like you said, now the futures thinking and foresight work has a voice in a way in this situation, and this is definitely the time now to communicate the benefits and all the advantages to do with this work and processes. And interesting with the students, I did already when I was quite a young guy. I already did about 15, I think it was 15 years ago. I set up a group from my student colleagues, and we actually started sparring CEOs in the large corporations, and there was a big buzz in the student community to trying to create the future. And I think this is quite actually natural to students especially, and people who they are curious, they investigate and they're learning every day something new. And this is a great asset I think you should definitely utilize. So yeah, thank you. That's my comment.
Yeah, that's why I threw in the students, the academe students and the youth in there, because normally they're the ones who are looking for change all the time. So I just wanted a perspective of your experiences there. Dr. Suhail, any comments? Okay, if Dr. Suhail is not ready right now, then let me proceed with the Development Academy of the Philippines. Dean Lizan Perante Kalina will make a presentation. And we also have other DAP fellows with her, Dr. Maria Oliva Domingo, Dr. Reginald Ugadan, Dr. Alex Brillantes, and Professor Herisadel Flores. So, Dean Lizan, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Senator Pia Cayetano, and to the honorable members of this committee. Thank you for the privilege given to us this afternoon, and we are also grateful to Sir Noel Patnubay and also to Attorney Kim Francis for facilitating this one. So the Development Academy of the Philippines and the Graduate School of Public and Development Management would like to share before this committee its policy foresight framework anchored on futures thinking. This presentation will delve into the operationalization of futures thinking by taking into consideration our own narratives, our metaphors, as well as our policy tools and analytical and quantitative ones. But before I start, of course, I'd like to introduce our senior fellows, Dr. Alex Brillantes, Dr. Domingo, Prof. Del Flores, Dr. Reggie Ugadan, along with our research associates CJ Almodal and Celine Abelia. So taking off from the presentations of Dr. Suel, Dr. Tomo, and Dr. Sako and also Dr. Wagner's earlier, I would like to emphasize first our Filipino values, and one of which is bayanihan, as represented by Bahay Kubo, a native Philippine nipa house. Please show our next slide, Celine. Carried by neighbors in a community. So our next slide will show our bayanihan or native nipa house. And this Bahay Kubo is, as I mentioned earlier, a native Philippine nipa house carried by neighbors in a community. And the word bayanihan has three main ideas: bayan, bayani, at anihan, in which bayanihan can be considered as an important handle for policy foresight. Other values include compassion or pakikipagkapwa, as mentioned by Senator Coco Pimentel last Tuesday. The other two, as shown in our slide, or other, yes, paggalang at pakikisama. So these are just few of our Filipino values that we are mentioning today. And these values, including our culture, reaffirm its importance of making our own narrative towards a Philippine futures thinking mindset. And to add on this, my colleague Professor Del Flores has something to say.
Thank you very much, Dinlizan. Madam Chair, we can say that futures thinking is embedded in national symbols and narratives. The bayanihan mentioned by Dinlizan earlier, where the villagers carry the houses of their neighbors on their shoulders when they transfer to a more fertile land, highlights Filipino compassion, which ensures that nobody would be left behind as our communities march towards progress. Another national symbol is the balangay, from which the term barangay is derived. The balangay is the legendary boat that our ancestors boarded to reach and settle our islands. This concept emphasizes the importance of leadership and vision, which will allow us to reach our intended developed nation. As we can also see, Madam Chair, futures thinking can both be considered old and new. Old because in the past, authors and scholars had always been interested in what the future holds for individuals and societies. We might be familiar with George Orwell's book, 1984, published in 1949, which anticipated Big Brother technology half a century before the Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks incidents. More recently, Yuval Noah Harari's 21 Lessons for the 21st Century explored the personal and social ramifications of profound advances in information technology and biotechnology. Locally, Dr. Jose Rizal, through his The Philippines a Century Hence, talked about the possibility of our country becoming an American colony a full decade before it actually happened. Other local efforts would include the UP NCPAG's 1998 publication, The Philippines into the 21st Century, a future scenarios for governance, democracy, and development, 1998 to 2025, and NEDA's Ambition Natin 2040. Notice that the first document was written by one person, the next by a group of academics, including our very own Dr. Domingo, and the last is a collective output of many people based on the ideas of ordinary Filipinos, especially the youth. We may also recognize that while the first dealt more with visions and predictions of the future, which may or may not come into being, the last two are more about actionable goals and aspirations, which we can endeavor to transform into reality given adequate policy support. In this vein, we should also emphasize the need to balance the interests of individuals and families on one hand, and the society as a whole on the other hand. This could prove difficult as we are realizing now in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. We can also say that futures thinking is new because now it has become more systematic and employs various tools and methodologies that are more or less common among scholars utilizing this strategy. In a way, we can say that futures thinking is a natural stage in the evolution, planning, and policymaking techniques. It is based on both factual evidence, which we may discover through the use of data analytics and big data, among other quantitative tools, and also on the human dimension, which deals with the feelings, perceptions, and aspirations of the people. It therefore dwells, as our international experts emphasized earlier, both on numerical data and also on narratives and the power of stories, on scientific truth, as well as on the beliefs of people. In this diagram, we can see that futures thinking is about what is and will be possible based on existing and developing technologies, what people need and aspire to, and what the government and society should do in terms of policy and action to address these needs and realize these aspirations. All of these are influenced by and also have an effect on the environment, which we should be able to both master in spite of its seeming unpredictability and also protect to promote the quality of life of the people and other species with whom we share our planet, as well as the succeeding generations. Thank you. At this point, let me transfer you to Dr. Reggie, who will discuss the methodologies and our proposed framework for futures thinking in our country.
Thank you very much, Prof. Del and Dinlisan, and also to the honorable members of the committee. Let me continue on the discussion of the adoption of futures thinking perspective in the realm of public policy and strategies in the Philippine context. Futures thinking and foresight is, of course, increasingly being utilized in many countries to inform policy. We have to be reminded, however, employing the idea of futures thinking must satisfy the principle of evidence-based or data-based policies or strategies. For example, in this slide, you may observe that do the right thing right requires both right data and right method. Of course, we have to avoid doing the right thing wrong, or doing the wrong thing right, doing the right thing wrong, and doing the wrong thing wrong. As you may already know, it is simply avoiding the error of the third kind in policy analysis. From here, let me present to you the proposed strategic foresight framework for SDGs designed for the Philippine context. The next slide, please. So the framework emerges from contemporary. Celine, can you please move to the next slide? The framework emerges from contemporary strategic foresight literature, the environmental, of course, considering the macro and micro context of the Philippine government, Philippine public sector, and governance values of the Philippine government. The framework is enclosed with the behavioral values of phronetic leadership. We argue that such futures thinking or strategic foresight framework may effectively and efficiently work with the values of phronetic leaders. Dean Lizan will elaborate on this in a while. Let me discuss briefly the 5 elements of the input, foresight work, outputs, or lots of techniques that we may employ here, such as Delphi or near future context, and among others. So the question that we may focus on here is that looking and seeing what is really happening. The second element, foresight, this covers the 3 broad steps in, of course, in logical sequence or logical order. First, in the analysis, it entails an in-depth analytical work of clarifying what seems to be happening in the environment. So a popular tool here, a lot of tools, but one of the popular tools is the trend analysis. Second is the interpretation. It seeks to go deeper on the phenomena and probe what's really happening. And third, prospection is looking forward to create forward views. So here, creating alternative futures as well as scenarios. Following a holistic approach and the process to be emergent, it requires the process of the participatory or interplay of the policymakers, the stakeholders, as well as experts, possibly scholars, futurists, or future agents, as well as the stakeholders. As we go down, the output here, outputs may be considered or may be more than tangible and intangible outputs. Tangible may be, of course, possible options or maybe from forward views or scenarios, while those intangible are the possible changes in behaviors in the process of advancing the forward views. the basic question that needs to be addressed here is that what might we need to do? From scenarios, output may bring out our own narratives that may help in rolling out strategies. From that stage, moving forward to strategy, now it making it more unique and distinct in our context or strategic actions. So last, monitoring and performance, you will explain further about what is this phonetic leadership that we've mentioned in the framework in our way forward. Lizan?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Reggie. As shown earlier, in the earlier slide, phonetic leadership is one of the key features that will drive or operationalize the entire strategic foresight framework. Phonetic leadership, or PL, is an Aristotelian doctrine wherein phronesis, or practical wisdom, is an important factor in identifying alternative scenarios and probabilities. So PL's dynamism is further driven by the six abilities of a wise or frenetic leader. And this include first the ability to make judgment based on goodness. And this is really about wisdom of a leader. Second, the ability is the ability to articulate the essence. No? To articulate and to sense the essence is all about making narratives. No? So the leader must have this ability. The third ability is the ability to create ba. Ba is a Japanese word which means to create a group sharing the same context. So this is really about participatory foresight. And the fifth is the ability to use political power. And the last is the ability to foster phronesis in others, meaning to say, by fostering phronesis, it is seeing goodness in others. So there is that participation and collaboration at all levels of the framework. So on that note, and based on the earlier slides, we would like to present key points as our ways forwards as ways forward rather. So since the committee of Senator Pia Cayetano spearheads this remarkable futures thinking platform, we find it appropriate to institutionalize the futures thinking initiatives for its sustainability through legislation and annual appropriation, if possible, by adopting earmarked budget scheme. And secondly, the creation of futures thinking office, for example, National Graduate Institute of Futures Thinking, or NGIFT, will help us build a community of scholars and practitioners through continuous capacity building and research across the Philippine bureaucracy, and later on to include the private sector. And also, there is a need to establish networking and communication mechanisms. With this, we will be able to create a continuous process of innovation. This is a key product of futures thinking. And lastly, we need to create an enabling environment to promote a culture of preparedness. And this is really about mind setting, and we really need this one. And I wonder if Dr. Alex has something to add on this. Sir Alex?
Uh, may I? Thank you so
Yes,
much,
Sir Alex.
Dr. Lisan. This was just a few minutes. One is when we talk about futures thinking, taking off from the presentations last time, there was this acronym called PESTLE, no? The drivers, who are the drivers of futures thinking? You have the political, economic, social, technological, legislative. It's within this context that, in this sense, right now, the drivers are the legislators through your leadership, Senator Pia. Equally important, the driver linking this to another important thing is linking it to the vision of the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. That's why I was really fascinated to listen to you and, of course, to our presenters, including Sohail. Actually, Sohail was my classmate when we were at the University of Hawaii in the 80s. And I did send him an email recently, and he was really easily one of the most brilliant students there. And little did I know that looking into the future, Sohail would really be one of our brightest thinkers at this point in time. Anyway, taking out from Sohail's presentation, he pointed out four things which have been incorporated into the framework discussed by Dean Lisan and the team. One is he talked about metaphors. Lisan and Del and my colleagues talk about the metaphor is as old as our bayanihan, working together as a community. No? Then Suhail also talk about the importance of strong leadership. We've been talking about phronetic leadership. What is phronetic leadership? It is practical wisdom. In Tagalog, sinasabi natin po, leadership po na naglalanding. Hindi lang po puro teorya, but practice, praxis. And that is what phronesis is all about. I think the caution of Senator Pia earlier about not being too much in the academic community is really taken note of, that we have to be phronetic. Kailangan pong maglanding. And the third part, Senator Pia mentioned about the importance of changing mindsets. Again, Yost also talked about that, behavioral changes. And the fourth one, Senator Coco talked about last time, is compassion. And that is very, very important in terms of the metaphors, in terms of the framework for our futures thinking project. But we all know, of course, that, as I mentioned earlier, we need to have practical wisdom, leadership. But of course, at the end of the day, as mentioned, of course, by Del, we build on what has been there for the longest time. And yes, we've been talking about this for some time. We all know about policy analysis. We all know about avoiding the error of the third kind. We all know about evidence based. So it's not really dreaming, but it's really rooted in the ground. So let me end by saying that a couple of us are also involved in the futures thinking with the Department of Education through the leadership of Secretary Briones and Undersecretary Nepo. And to a certain extent, we're very happy, Madam Chair, that we have this opportunity to share this. And as discussed by Dr. Lisan, champions, as discussed by Dr. Also earlier, the importance of champions is certainly. So certainly the elements are already there, and it's really making sense of this. And it is within this context that you and the committee takes the lead as one of the change drivers in this futures thinking initiative. So with that, marami pong salamat. Mabuhay po kayo, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you, Sir Alex. Thank you, Madam Chair, and to the honorable members of the committee. It's an honor for the Graduate School of DAP to be part of today's hearing. Muli magandang hapon po sa inyo lahat.
Thank you for that, Dr. Lizan, and to all the DAP fellows. That was very enlightening. Let me now acknowledge the presence of Senator Villar and Senator Go. Colleagues, anytime you have any questions, just feel free, no, wave or just open your mic, no problem. Before I go to the next speaker, because DAP precisely localized the discussion, no, by I appreciate that it was tied into bayanihan and all that, because since this topic is very new to us, I'm sure many like me make the mistake of thinking that futures thinking is all about the future, forgetting that the reality is it ties us down to who we really are. That is what it is supposed to be. It cannot be effective if it does not ground us as to who we are as a people, as a culture, etc. So I also appreciated that even our national hero, in a way, is considered a futures. It's a futures thinker, no? Which brings me to 2 points that I want to raise. In many ways, of course, all of us as policymakers, whether on the legislative side or in the executive side, I think it is part of our work to look into the future. But what distinguishes just this general acknowledgement that you have to plan for the future and to really say that you have a future thinking mindset? Because to me, it doesn't come naturally that you can really detach yourself from the well, you shouldn't detach yourself, but to really spend time and actually money, resources for that future. That's why when I conceptualize the need for a futures thinking office, and DepEd is the first one that has it already in their department, I really envisioned it as a separate body within DepEd na yun ang gagawin nila. Mag-isip kayo ng future scenario. Because naturally, not just lawmakers, but more importantly, executives get stuck in the now. So may I ask the resource persons, and including our local resource persons, what is that? I mean, to me, it's a mindset, no, and that's why it should be a separate practice just to get it into the habit of having that future thinking. And then number 2 question, can anyone help us understand as lawmakers what is the cost of not having a future thinking mindset or having a future thinking component in our lawmaking, in our budget process, in our planning for day to day and year in and year out. So anyone who'd like to give a response to that, I will just acknowledge you.
Madam Chair, may I be acknowledged?
Dean, yes, please go ahead.
For the first question, Madam Chair, futures thinking, it's really about mindsetting also, no? And it's a long process. We cannot shortcut this process, like we just have to go to backcasting right away. Really have to do a series of workshops for this matter. So it will take us time to really foresight. Kasi we don't predict we have to use foresight for this matter. That's why the policy tools are really important for us to have high leverage, evidence based, and high quality policy direction. And uh, and also we cannot really predict the future, no? So we use that foresight process, and by doing that, it will help us somehow know lessen, no, or mitigate what will happen in the future. So that's very important, and I think Dr. Lily Domingo will add some insights on this one.
Okay, Dr. Lily. Dr. Lily Domingo.
Thank you. Good afternoon to the chair and the members of the committee and all those who are listening. It is a privilege to be part of this hearing. We know very well that in any effort to do some change, to introduce change, there will always be resistance. And so we have to start by realizing that the resistance will be there because it requires us to change our ways of thinking and doing, to revolutionize how we have been doing things in the past. The usual comment is do not rock the boat. We are comfortable with the boat, so why rock it? And I think the lessons of COVID are telling us now that indeed we need to rock the boat ourselves to prepare for the future. So I'd like to talk about the 5 C's in all of this discussion. The first is about change and why we need to be ready for the resistance to change. The next is about culture. A very important factor in our framework has to do with the Philippine culture. Whatever we embark on needs to resonate with our beliefs, our traditions, our own stories. And part of our own story and our tradition is that the importance of family. And family means inclusiveness, participation. Nobody gets left out. And the next C has to do with co creation. When we create knowledge, when we create these scenarios and narratives for the future, we should make sure that it is not only a product of all, as mentioned earlier by Dr. Joss, but it is multidisciplinary, engaging all sectors of society. We have been talking about the metaphors of whole of government and whole of society. Now we're going to talk about embedding collaboration in everything that we do. And in order to collaborate and to co-create, we need a big C of communication. We are a nation of many ethnicities and languages. How do we get our stakeholders to participate, to understand the metaphors and the stories? And language has a very important role. How do we cascade the data? And how do we pick up the insights to add the human dimension when we talk about developing narratives for our future? Then the next big C is the C of continuity. Sometimes we make predictions of the future based on trends for the past 2, 3 months, 3 years. But when we talk about foresight thinking, we have to talk about a series of data over a long period of time. That's why we need futures thinking to be continuous and to be institutionalized. And we are recommending here an independent body, not swayed by any political or ideological or personal interest, but truly independent, and that is going to move us towards what Dr. Joss has just emphasized, from foresight to action, because that is what we need. And foresight thinking is a long learning journey. It is not just for a fixed term of office, 3 years, elected until 3 terms for 9 years. It is a long journey looking at a series of data, finding connections among them, connecting the dots. And I think I will just end my comment but say that by saying, well, how do we convince people to change mindset and to avoid resisting change is to accept that tomorrow is important today. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to comment? I want to give an example. When we study the countries who appear to be fairly successful in dealing with COVID, Hong Kong is one of them, and both Hong Kong and Korea have said that the reason they are dealing with this more successfully than others is because they learned from their experience in the past. No, I think it was SARS. So both countries, both Hong Kong and Korea, recognized that they experienced something, they learned lessons from it, and then they had changes that came after those experiences. And included in those changes are not just investing in laboratories, technology, but behavioral changes. So I've read about Hong Kong. Um, I've read articles and I know somebody who's there. It's not a friend, pero nag-post siya sa kanyang social media na parang back to normal practically ang life ng Hong Kong. Kasi yung mga tao doon, they really have no qualms about just wearing face masks and social distancing. So they can easily go back to something that's almost like normal because they already have these behavioral changes. So to add to the questions I have for the experts, what is more difficult, the behavioral change or institutional change, or are they one and the same? Because when I refer to institutional, I mean that there are laws, there are policies. So like now, it's becoming an institutional change. Everywhere, all the materials that you would read would include there that this presupposes or assumes that there is social distancing, wearing of mask. So pretty soon, that will, to me, become what you consider institutional change. But I also refer to behavioral change because alam na ngayon, pero pag nagkaroon ng pera na ilalabas, we've seen scenes of this all over the country, especially Metro Manila, nakalimutan na lahat ng social distancing. Nakalimutan na, dikit-dikit na, kasi pilahan na para sa pera. So the behavior is slow to follow, even though these institutional changes have been bombarded, disseminated for the last 60 days. So any comments from the experts? Yes, Professor Alex. I can't hear you. Can you hear?
Yes, ma'am.
There, okay.
We're actually involved right now with the United Nations, wherein it's really changing the mindset. The metaphor there is like an iceberg. Sometimes when we bring about change, we simply change laws, we change structures. What we don't see are the paradigms, the mindsets, the behavior is what is not seen in the iceberg. And that's the most important part. How do we change the mindsets? And I think that's an excellent project. That's why we talk about education, etc. But equally important, Madam Chair, we talk about the importance of leadership here. That's why we talk about kailangan na naglalanding. It's not all theory, it has to be practical. And when one talks about practical, you have evidence. And that goes to the third part, that we build upon hard-earned gains. Building upon hard-earned gains. Hindi komot nagbago ang administrasyon, magbago na naman lahat. We've seen that sometimes when administration changes, everything changes. But to the credit of this government, we have this ambition natin 2040, which was in previous administration. It continues up to today. I think that's an excellent example where we know our future. So yun lang po, ma'am. Building upon hard-earned gains, and the importance of continuity, as Dr. Lily pointed out, leadership that is landed, may practical wisdom po. So I think that right now, ma'am.
Thank you, thank you. Josh, do you have anything to add to that before I call on our next guest?
Thank you, Senator Pia. Just maybe 2 or 3 things that go into my mind. First of all, you asked for the cost of not doing future thinking. I think everybody knows now what happens thanks to COVID, that what happens when you are not prepared, right? Dr. Suhail has published his most read article in the Journal of Future Studies about Black Swan and the zombies he talked about last time. I mean, many public health persons and many futurists were warning about inaction for pandemic preparedness, and now we get the bill, right? I mean, of course, it's always difficult, and you as policymakers know it better than anybody, I guess. If you want to have a budget for preparing something that is in an unlikely distant future, it can be really what do you call it, a Don Quixote. You are trying to fight the windmills to convince your colleagues to allocate budget. So very difficult. But from companies, they have also experienced that. I mean, in many examples, you all probably have heard about, you don't want to be Kodak, right? Companies that don't see the signs of change and don't invest in change might disappear from the market. Kodak, Nokia, it's a Finnish company. Maybe I shouldn't give a Finnish example. They came back slightly. And many other examples, what happens if a company don't see the change coming or prepare for change. So, and behavior, on the topic of behavioral, I think my colleagues already made some good comments. I come actually additionally from a public health background. I don't have a PhD. Thanks, by the way, for the honorary PhD this morning. I would like to keep it, but I guess it's not possible. But I continued later with additional public health studies. So I worked on behavioral change communication, HIV/AIDS in India, and to change people's mindsets, yes, there are many factors, and it's very, very difficult. One way I think to change mindsets and behaviors is what Madam Oliva said, I think. She mentioned co-creation, of course. Things you co-create together, I think you create ownership. And another colleague was mentioning about it takes a long time. So one track you can start, of course, is exposing people to future thinking, even in schools. I mean, there are a couple of countries who have actually started to have it in the curriculum. I mean, to get it into the curriculum needs a lot of work again, but future thinking could also be incorporated in standard curricula in schools. I think Finland is anyway the leading example in Europe that future thinking. I think, yeah, Finland is number one. I think my colleague would probably confirm that when it comes to future thinking in a European country. And I know countries who have started future thinking in schools. So I think we can build on something and locally adapt it with the help of all these experts here, maybe in the room, in the virtual room, to make it a Filipino way of future literacy. Over.
Madam Chair.
Thank you. Yes, Senator Francis, please, you have the floor.
Yes, I've been listening. And one of them can answer. Is the Philippines right now on a reboot or reset stage insofar as the sustainable development goals are concerned? Because, Madam Chair, I think this COVID-19 pandemic crisis highlighted the great gulf divide between rich countries and poor countries. In developed countries, they're talking about unemployment insurance. In developed countries, they're talking about the new normal in terms of having a better economy, for instance, because of the resources that they have. But in our country, if we look at it realistically, I believe most of the SDG gains have been eroded. We're still trying to achieve SDG goal number 3 in terms of good health, but this pandemic really brought havoc on our health system. And for instance, the committee hearing we conducted early this morning is about SDG goal number 4, the quality education. UNESCO estimates that some 1.25 billion students are affected worldwide, and a lot of other things. 25 million could lose their jobs. So what I'm thinking is this: how will the future's thinking guide us in a post-COVID-19 world wherein poor countries, undeveloped countries, not just in this part of the hemisphere, but in other parts of the globe, are still struggling to meet, for instance, their food security requirements, their water and sanitation targets, DG goal number 6. You have to wash your hands how many times a day? But in other countries, you don't even have faucets in your household. So what I'm saying is this: different countries are providing different stimulus packages. Is the Philippines in a position to provide a sustainable stimulus package, or are we really on a reboot stage? We have to start from scratch again. If any of the resource persons probably can answer my question. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair. Yes, may I be recognized? Looking at the SDGs, I just want to give some of our initiatives because foresight or futures thinking is really a long process, but we are doing some initiatives right now. We did some policy foresight responses to COVID-19, and one of which, as an answer to SDG number 3, is the e-health solutions. So we made some collaboration already with our partners, with other stakeholders, UP, for example, DOH, no, and among others. So we develop, for now, courses. No, we are looking at the soft skills because we have technologies already, hard technology, but we don't have the soft skills, and we need to develop that. So that's one. Another is really the take the approach of a whole society or whole of government approach. So one is our e-decalogo, wherein we co-create and share knowledge, and with that, we somehow empower the community, no, to have better and correct information about the directives of the national government on COVID responses. So these are initiatives. Another thing is looking at the future because of COVID-19 is the establishment of national stockpile or local stockpile, wherein we'll have our ready stocks now or supplies in case of another pandemic. But of course, we don't want that to happen, or in case of another disaster. So these are some policy foresight responses, but we are still in the process of really collaborating and studying. I think Dr. Lily Domingo has something more to say on this one. Ma'am Lily and Sir Alex as well. Thank you, Senator.
Yes, yes, please proceed, Dr. Lily and Dr. Alex.
Know about how third world countries are going to cope with scenarios that futures thinking will bring us, given that we are still focused on satisfying certain basic needs. Will bring us back to certain concepts of futures thinking that we should always take into consideration. These are the metaphors of the black swan and the black elephant. The black swans are those that we thought are not possible. They're rare, but they have very widespread and extreme implications, just like COVID. But while we are looking into how we address the black swan issues, there are black elephants in the room. And among the black elephants are how do we provide for these basic needs? They've always been there, but futures thinking should not make us forget if there are basic needs we need to continuously address, such as what do we do with the backlog of housing, given that COVID now is telling us about social distancing? What do we do about providing for sanitation when there are homes that have no water? So while we deal with the black swan, let us not forget about the black elephants. And whether or not the Philippines is capable of addressing all of these, and where are we in terms of the SDGs, we have to again remember that we live in a VUCA world. There are so many forces that continuously change that affect what we are thinking now and planning to do might not even be relevant or appropriate tomorrow. And that is why we go back to the need for continuously assessing, analyzing, interpreting all of these developments so that our narratives and our pictures of the future are more realistic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lily. Dr. Alex, did you want to respond?
Yes, ma'am. Just very quickly. Uh, I think we do have the fundamental elements there already. We have, as we all know, the SDGs. We have the ambition natin 2040. How do we bring it down to that level? But equally important, as we know, as Senator Tolentino mentioned, the importance of now goal 16, strong institutions. How strong are our institutions? It's within this context, I think, that we should always bring into the picture the role of our subnational governments, our local governments. For after all, they are the frontliners. And equally important, so the academic institutions are not left behind themselves, being quote unquote knowledge co-creators. I think they should be part of the process, what we call within the context of town and gown, because it's very important, as you suggested earlier, Madam Chair, is that sometimes people in the university might remain in the ivory tower. We have to come down to the real world. But there's a lot of knowledge out there. How do we bridge the knowledge between the town and gown? So strong institutions, local governments, and also our academic institutions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So let me just have a follow-up question from your statement, Professor Alex. When you mention local government, no, for example, Taguig City, my brother is the mayor. It so happened that they have been preparing for COVID because they also have a city epidemiologist, no. So they had the luxury, hindi man the luxury, but they had a little bit more time to prepare for that. So it's not magic. It's just that they were able to prepare a little bit sooner because they had expert advice available. So moving forward, you would actually recommend that LGU officials, and based on the other input that I've been getting, like from Dean, it's not magic, no. You cannot just change the way people think. So it's really a process that we would need to recommend that LGUs go through themselves so that they can start using it, because you know how it's not just a thrust, but it's based on the local government code, is that they are autonomous and they should be, you know, really have the means to prepare their cities and their towns for whatever. Having said that, there are also future thinking studies that really tell us, talk to us now about the independence of cities, no? It's not just saying autonomy in terms of how do you want your people to do certain things, but it's really saying that there seems to be a directional move towards cities wanting or feeling it is necessary to be self-sufficient when it comes to their water, self-sufficient when it comes to their energy and their own food. Medyo mabigat yun, to think of cities in the middle of metropolitan areas to be able to have that kind of self-sufficiency.
I think
But
I lost you.
that apparently is where some outcomes look like they are heading. So just a comment on that also.
May I say something, ma'am? Very
Yes,
quickly.
Professor Alex, ikaw. Yes.
Well,
Please respond.
yes. Actually, precisely. I think we should never forget the role of local governments, because at the end of the day, they are the frontliners. But what I would like to add here, ma'am, well, of course, Chairman Tolentino, is that it's really interlocal cooperation. Interlocal cooperation. I think what we have today is how to encourage our local governments to cooperate with each other, because there are certain things, environment, there are certain things, ecology, that do not respect political administrative boundaries. So they have to cooperate. It's within the context that even in my presentation, I think a couple of weeks back, we have interlocal cooperation, say in Baguio. Bliss, Baguio, La Trinidad, Itogon. So I think that's very, very important for LGUs to cooperate between and among each other. And of course, we have local governments that are indeed have responded to this on their own, cooperating with national government. I think I lost him, ma'am.
Yeah, Madam Chair,
Yes.
Madam Chair,
Senator Francis, go ahead.
I totally agree with the comments given by Dr. Brillantes. I've known him since I was mayor of Tagaytay years ago. It just highlights the resilience being shown right now by the country is exemplified by the LGUs, the local officials, the local government units. In fact, right now, they're the ones crafting modifications to our GCQ, modified GCQ standards. And it just shows that the SDG goals, when we look forward after this COVID-19 pandemic, will have to be pushed forward and hammered on by the LGUs. There is no other way, Madam Chair. That's how the future would look like. Even if you look at the U.S. experience, it just shows that you have state governments, Governor Cuomo, and the rest leading the states in combating this pandemic. But again, I would say that the SDG goals are still there, though eroded, and we look forward to rebooting it in the near future with more fervor. And we join you, Ms. Madam Chair, in highlighting through this through the efforts of your committee, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Senator Tolentino. And your input is always very valuable. I acknowledge what you just said about giving your experience also as mayor, because what I also understand from the Metro Manila mayors is that they're trying to, they move as one. Because hindi pwedeng kanya-kanya sila, because a lot of their constituents would be moving in and out of each of their cities on a daily basis. Whether things go back to whatever sense of normal, these people will be moving in and out, so hindi pwedeng kanya-kanya. And I guess that's the same experience you have with your neighboring cities and provinces in Tagaytay, di ba? Batangas, Cavite, ganun din, and Metro Manila, of course. So I resonate. I think I have a message here from Professor Flores. Professor Flores would like to say something. Senator Villar also. Senator Villar, let's Senator Villar first, and then after that, Professor Flores.
I just want to comment on the role of local government and barangay, this ECQ. Parang yung mga barangay natin, parang ang tingin nila, ang role nila sa ECQ, sarahan nila lahat ng kalye, which is not the case. So, nagkakaroon tayo ng kalye, nag-ECQ tayo, so we will spread for the sake of closing roads. Kasi in the afternoon, I go around with Senator Manny to see what's happening around us. I'm so surprised that ang mga barangay captain, sinasaraan nila lahat ng kalye, which is not the essence of it. So, baka nagkaka-misinterpretation ang ating mga barangay captain na ang ECQ ay they have the right to close all the roads of the barangay. That's not the spirit of the law. In fact, marami nagko-complain sa DILG why the barangay captains are closing out all the roads. So, yun ang question ko. Interpretation of the law, kung hindi naman alam ng mga barangay captain, it is subject to abuse. Kaya we should take notice of that kasi I think unnecessary na yung ibang closing of the roads.
Maganda yung background ko, dalawang flag, di ba?
Thank you for your comments, Senator Villar. May I now call on Professor Flores?
Hello, good afternoon, Madam Chair. I would just like to comment on regarding institutions. I'm very glad that you mentioned the relationship or the possible relationship between institutions and culture and also the behavior of people. Supposedly, institutions in the economic sense should be able to structure human interactions and also, in a way, affect the behavior of people so that we will be able to achieve our societal goals. However, let me also expound that when we say institutions, there are actually different kinds of institutions, like what we call formal institutions, which may include rules, regulations, and also laws and ordinances, and also what we call informal institutions, which are traditions, mores, and also exclusive codes of conduct of different organizations and communities. And also, we have what we call the enforcement mechanisms of these institutions. All of these are important since, for example, when we talk about our formal rules and regulations, the laws and the ordinances, sometimes we might see that they might not be that effective in terms of influencing the behavior of people because sometimes what takes over would be what we call the informal institutions. For example, we know that we are a very closely knit society where it's very difficult to implement social distancing during these times. But given that, we should also make our formal institutions sensitive to our informal institutions. That is because sometimes informal institutions are more effective because they are self-enforcing, unlike formal institutions, which would need internal structures to be able to be uh, enforced. Given that, it's also important that we are uniform and also fair in terms of enforcing our institutions. I'm now talking about the enforcement mechanisms because without that, we can't really expect the people to change their behaviors and follow these rules and regulations. I think that's all what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that intervention. May I call again on Dean Lizan? She'd like to make a comment and I think present something.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to share very briefly a framework on SDGs. Particularly, this is on the impact of COVID-19 to the realization of our SDG goals. Celine is showing us the slide now. So, okay, just a very few seconds. Okay. So basically, like for example, in that framework, we have COVID-19 pandemic, and what is its impact? For number one, that's loss of income, leading vulnerable segments of society and families to fall below poverty line. And if I go to SDG goal number 17 on partnership for the goals, it will aggravate backlash against globalization, but also highlight the importance of international cooperation on public health. So what I'm saying and the framework is trying to present is that we can use this later on to make foresight, no, foresight policy report, and make this as a basis on how are we going to develop our framework and policy direction in order for us to achieve and realize our SDGs. Not only localization, but also teaching SDGs in universities and colleges. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you for that, Dean Lizan. That's a great visual for the committee, no, because both topics being new to the Senate in terms of being for committee work, no, by combining the SDGs and future thinking. I'm always trying to intermingle the two because I feel that they're related. But this COVID example and the visual you gave, I think would be a great way for us to really see how we can move on. Senator Francis nga mentioned how do we now go about achieving those goals. So thank you for that, and we'll include that and of course invite you in our future hearings. Before we go to the next presenter, let me just acknowledge the other persons who are here. I'm not sure if I acknowledge Senator Coco's presence, so Senator Coco Pimentel. And then also from various offices. Sorry, I'm just looking for my notes. USEC Rosemary Edilion of NEDA, DOF ASEC Paula Alvarez, Dr. Eric Tayag of DOH, and ASEC Sheila Napalang of DOTR. And we also have representatives from DepEd, DICT, DPWH, TESDA, DSUD, and DOLE, and DA. Please feel free to write down any questions or comments that you have. We do have international experts with us, so let's take advantage of their presence. So feel free, the agency representatives, to just post your questions, and I can read it to the group. So with that, I will now call on the next presenter, who is Pratiksha Singh. He's the head of experimentation, UNDP Asia Pacific Regional Center. Pratiksha, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Senator. Hi, everybody. My name is Pratiksha. I'm joining you here from Bangkok. I hope you're able to hear me. Yes, okay, perfect.
It's clear.
I think this is really great to have heard so many of the speakers, and I think what I'm about to share with you today will, I think, draw from different speakers and what they've shared and build on it. So I am with the UNDP's Asia Pacific Regional Innovation Center, and our role in Bangkok is to really support our country offices in the region, who then, of course, work as direct counterparts with governments in their respective countries. What I wanted to do with my time with you today was maybe twofold, was focus my first half of the presentation on sharing examples of different governments and how different governments have embedded foresight in their practices across different governance levels, so from city to national. And then the second half of my presentation, I'd like to share some work with you around what UNDP's Asia Pacific Innovation Center has done explicitly to try to understand what's happening at COVID, and how can we then provide some valuable insight to our country offices to support government counterparts in their immediate and as well as medium to long-term response needs that have surfaced because of COVID. So with that, I'll start off with just sharing a broader thing. And I think some of the things I will share will hit upon some of your prior questions as well, in terms of how can we institutionalize this? What is the cost of maybe not doing this? And what are different models? So with that, the first way that we've seen several, I'll start from lower level of commitment, or not commitment, but embedding, to maybe a much more thorough embedding in government. So we have seen in various countries around the world who start off with having units. So they're specialized units of strategic foresight that are present in various governments. We see this in countries like India, Japan, Singapore. There are different models even within just having specialized units. In Singapore, there's a unit that supports that can support multiple ministries. So it acts as somewhat of a convener in using foresight and in creating partnerships and dialogue and initiatives. In India and Japan, there are specialized units of foresight that support particular ministries in their desire to incorporate foresight. And so you can start to see that there's different models already. Then you have, for example, the government of Saudi Arabia, where you have the minister, the cabinet, you have the Minister of the Cabinet Affairs as well as the Future. So this was a new reshuffle in 2016 where they added the Future. And really his purview is quite explicitly to look at what would a post-oil economy look like. But that's not just where his work ends. The minister is also responsible for strategies that would look at what are future models for health, education, development, environment, and as well as harmonization of current government policies look like when we actually start to embed foresight at a national capacity level. Also, actually, to a point that was made previously in terms of embedding it into the education system, the UAE is one of those countries that is actually looking under this ministry, how can foresight be, in more simplified terms, become a part of school curriculum from very early ages, so that they start to develop this sort of thinking practice in students from a very, very early age. And the goal ultimately in a foresight standpoint is how can other countries turn to UAE to learn how can they sort of institutionalize foresight as a practice, not just as an independent unit, but really as a way of doing. Then there's a different kind of example. So there's a ministry, for example, in Dubai that I just shared. There's a minister who's responsible for convening these conversations, for leading these types of strategy discussions, and for leading the development of future strategies in these various different sectors, working in partnership with different ministries. Then, for example, a very different kind of example was quite early. So Dubai was 2016 when we saw the shuffle surface this ministerial role. Hungary, for example, though in 2008, established the Hungarian Parliamentary Commissioner for Future Generations. So in 2008, this role was to sort of reinforce the advocacy for the natural environment and to safeguard intergenerational justice. That was this position's responsibility. And one of the ways that they were going to do this was have any citizen who wanted to ask about the environmental implications of something that was coming up could reach out to this, to this government position and ask them to look into this. And so the fundamental agenda was to create a sense of legitimacy and transparency in which the government was creating policy and how actually citizens could intervene and have a voice if they had questions or didn't quite agree with the way something was going. So this was quite unique because it's also in 2008, well before a lot of these discussions were happening on the government level. But what you will notice in its limitation, perhaps, is that it was explicitly about the natural environment and the aspect of intergenerational justice from this lens. I think a deeper, maybe a build on this came in 2015 when Wales introduced the Well-Being of Future Generations Act in 2015. And this act was really about saying, how can Wales think about the long-term impact of its decisions and work better with its communities and its people to cut across a variety of very deep systemic problems such as poverty, health inequality, or climate change. And then in 2016, they actually brought on their Future Generation Commissioner, which was first position of its kind in the world, I suppose, and that was Sophie Howe. And her role really was to somewhat act as an auditor for future generations. She was called, the first minister of the unborn. She's a guardian of the interest of future generations. And her aim was, through this position and this act, to look at developing long-term solutions in a long-term, non-political, non-party way. So I think this point was also raised earlier. How do we do this in which it's not so laden with the politics of the present? And so that's what Wales was trying to experiment with. And they've already had main sort of impacts on policies such as land use, transportation, housing. And in practice, for example, when we are bringing in new companies to cities or different geographies, we often speak about the number of jobs they will bring. And her role as auditor was to also ask, beyond just bringing in new jobs, how is bringing in these companies also impacting, for example, the environment, the communities, transportation links, and other such sort of wider implications. So, and her role it gives her the position to, the position has particular teeth because her position allows us also to have, judicial review where a judge can actually, in the courts, access and assess if the public body that is proposing something actually is following the Future Generations Act or not. And if they're not, there is a legal courseway to actually course correct what is happening. So that's actually fundamentally quite powerful in terms of how it's also got a legislative counterpart to sink its teeth. There's also, of course, ways in which we are seeing governments closer to home, such as Singapore and New Zealand, really quite try to integrate more robust frameworks of foresight and how they're doing things. I will share some of these examples in a few minutes, but I just wanted to start off by sharing a few examples in different ways in which governments around the world are really looking to embed foresight and what that has sort of looking like. There was another question, I think, that was shared either last session or earlier this session, which was about where do we even start? What does it look like? So I wanted to share just some example in ways governments have done this. One of the first things many governments, such as New Zealand, Canada, and New South Wales did was they actually went through an entire civil service reform. New Zealand did this in 2013. And what the civil service reform did was that it actually fundamentally created a OneGov group, and it was an integrated civil services appraisal. So no longer were you appraised based on how your ministry was doing, but based on how actually it integrated ministerial work on an issue was generating results. So it immediately now cuts away this desire or natural inclination to compete into something that actually now pushes people to collaborate by virtue of how actually appraisals happen. So that was a fundamental move that many countries have taken in order to really bring this as part of a culture, not just as having a minister or a position who audits that. So you can see some of the tensions that might happen in a Wales model where other public bodies feel like they have to defend what they want to do against this act. And for example, a New Zealand model of actually now integrating foresight through an appraisal system, which is entirely different from what we might think of as a logic to bring this in. Next, I wanted to share a bit of a slightly different set of examples. To what end can we use foresight as a policymaker or a lawmaker for all of you sitting in this hearing? What are some different ways in which it can serve you to actually do your work, other than sort of making better policies in the sense that if you have an anticipatory angle, if you have the ability to see alternatives, surely you might see your own oversight or consider things that you might not have previously, right? There's a value in that. But the other aspect of this actually that foresight offers that a few governments are starting to play with is actually how can we use foresight as a way to actually have much deeper conversations with our constituents? How can we also take the issues we are grappling with that are deeply complex and convert them to issues that can allow more of our citizens to see themselves in it and then actually see their stake and agency in it, which is something often that's fundamentally missing in how we actually approach complex issues like climate change or COVID. So for example, I wanted to share across that spectrum. So there's, of course, it can help you, foresight can help you, as our speakers have all before me emphasized, in making policy differently. Singapore certainly has a very, very integrated framework, foresight framework in how it does urban planning. So I'm happy to share an example in how they do that. They have 3 layers in their urban planning. The first layer actually sets a goal for the next 40 to 50 years, and this development plan is subject to review every 10 years. And then there's a medium-term plan that comes underneath this master plan, and that's about land use patterns and transportation networks. And that's revised every 5 years based on what's actually happening to make sure that it's actually in touch with reality. And then there's a sub-layer, which is a third layer, which is a detailed construction plan. And that is about near-term development. And that has a 5 to 10 year range, but that is looked at also quite regularly. So you can see how the master, the medium, and the more immediate term detailed construction plans work in synchronicity to make sure that the larger long-term overall concept is constantly being pulse checked, as well as being sort of made proofed, where the needs are. And then there's a whole example of participatory foresight, which is where we can actually take foresight outside of the realms of just discussions like ours into that of discussions with our constituents, with our citizens, to have deeper dialogue. And there are some very, very interesting examples in our own region. But I also want to preempt that by saying something, which is that participatory foresight and foresight as a practice we're speaking about today and have on Tuesday is about how we can apply it in governments. One of the first maybe authors actually of foresight is actually Indigenous communities, and Indigenous communities both in the US, in North America, as well as Asia. And I say that now because before I preempt my example with participatory foresight, I wanted to share how and why that's valuable for US policymakers to consider. The Iroquois tribe in North America is very famous for having talked about 7 generations. And the notion or importance there was whenever they made any decisions, they considered 7 generations forward. And it wasn't about imagining a future 7th generation, but it was actually about imagining themselves as the 7th generation, which was now looking back at their own decisions 7 generations ago. So the fundamental difference now is that if you as a policy are making a policy and you imagine yourself 7 generations from now looking back at what you made, how might that fundamentally change just the lens, even if it's a question in how you do your work. And so that was principles we have been seeing for millennia in terms of how indigenous communities from the Iroquois to the Amani Island in Japan were actually incorporating this sort of decision-making framework. So the next example I wanted to share with you was on participatory futures in Japan in the present. So the Japanese government in 2015 and 2016 asked every city and town in the country to make a future plan of 2060. And they asked that they draw current policies that would then speak to this future plan of 2060. The Regional Innovation Hub spoke to Professor Saijo Tatsuyoshi. He's a professor in Japan, and he's also the author of a series of experiments called Future Design. And this is where I bring our examples down to the mayoral level and the city level. Just 2 or 3 quick examples before I move forward. He worked, for example, in the Yahabe town in the Iwate prefect, which was very close to where earthquake had happened a few years ago. And what he did was he actually divided up citizens into 2 groups. And this is fundamentally about sort of an embodied experiential way of doing foresight and how do we get citizens and just individuals to think about the future differently. He simply asked you, he split the room into 2 and asked you to think of yourselves as present generation and 1 group to think of themselves as a future generation. And he basically used this imaginary future generation work to also emerge and work on issues that the city wanted to work on around intergenerational divide, something that they were seeing present now that they saw only getting further deeper. What this led to is actually the mayor introducing the Institute for Future 22, which in this city now allowed for any new future policy to be thought through from the perspective of the future. From the success of this exercise of running it with citizens and just seeing how people actually started to change their perceptions by just imagining a future generation in the conversation as a stakeholder. And then further in 2019, the mayor announced the Yahabe town as a future design town and actually introduced a future strategy division, which made future plans for the town. So it was responsible now. He created a whole division that was responsible for making future strategies using this kind of methodology of having the future as a stakeholder. There are other examples where he also used, these 2 cities, these 2 groups of people who don on different costumes to separate themselves as current citizens and future citizens to look at just how they might even remodel a city building. And the point there is just what you would even consider to redesign a city building were wildly different when you were looking as the present or when you were looking at yourself as a future citizen. And the last example that I want to share that I think hits on something that came up earlier in our discussion today in terms of how can we make this happen? Sure, we can do workshops. This also was a workshop format. He did workshops at 1-month intervals in these various cities. In Kyoto in particular, I wanted to share this example with you. Kyoto, the prefect provides water to 10 different cities and towns in the southern part of Kyoto. And they were also dealing with a population decline, maintenance problems, and particularly an issue related to water. So he divided the group up into thinking about this issue from 2 perspectives. One was, can you see the future from the present? So if you're sitting in 2020 and you're dealing with the issue of water and actually providing water to 10 cities, can you think about can you just think about this topic from the perspective of sitting in 2020, what would you do about distributing water in 2040? The responses were somewhat like, we would maintain the water pipes and including making them more earthquake resistant. And then a second exercise or question frame, very simple, just the question was changed, was now, if you imagine yourself in 2040, what would you have done in 2020? To deal with water and distributing water to 10 different cities? The answers were completely different. The answers when you're sitting in 2040 and looking at saying what you should do in 2020 were everything from there should actually be no water supply using pipes. You should actually look at entirely new technologies that do water purification that don't rely on pipes. And fundamentally, that actually would probably be impossible to provide all the water needs by pipes by 2040. So you can start to see just posing a different question and using a different time frame now started to get people to see the same issue from a very, very different perspective. And I think that's part of how we start to make foresight a part of how we're doing our work. These are very, very simple things, very simple examples of questions simply that were posed to participants that started to now embed a different way of doing. And he has said that actually many cities have now called him to bring this methodology to them. And he has not had to go to any city to propose this to them other than the first one, which was Yahabe town. So I just wanted to pose that as an example to you, as interesting examples within our own region of how we can use participatory foresight on just a very basic city level. There are other examples I'm happy to share with you afterwards that have to do with Newcastle, also using a participatory framework to imagine a Newcastle in the year 2060, and using universities as the vehicle to do this work. And the whole point there was, how can universities actually give back something to the cities in which they're housed? So instead of always, instead of sort of taking, how can the city and use its environmental and intellectual capacity to convene to actually share back something entirely different to the city in which it is hosted. So those were a few examples. I also just wanted to quickly share that the possibility of governments to do very radical things when they convene. So Canada, for example, is an example of a government. There is a particular ministry in Canada called ESDC, which is the largest ministry. It's called the Employment and Social Development Canada. It actually ran a sense-making exercise in the government before doing a policy across multiple ministries, convening them on this issue of brain drain and skill employment readiness. What does that mean in a time when people are leaving? How can we actually create policies that enable us to retain our resources domestically? And what they were able to do in this sort of almost radical exercise is actually they were able to accomplish changing 26 policies in 23 months by doing the sense-making exercise across line ministries as a joint exercise on this one issue before they even got into making the policy-making process. It was just about convening and discussing together in a sense-making process. I also just quickly wanted to share what are ways in which we can actually use foresight to make more powerful decisions. I think what I just shared with you was ways in which we can use foresight to make, to appeal to our rational side. So it's the studies, it's the different ways in which we can find ourselves data. We can do projections. And then the other part actually is an embodied undertaking. So there's an intellectual understanding and an embodied undertaking. And that is where we have tried, and members of our own team at RIC at UNDP have either worked that very quickly would be, for example, in Dubai, we used their use of real simulated data on air pollution to actually have the minister breathe simulated real air, constructed what it would probably smell like in the year 2050. So he had to take a puff of this real but simulated air. So that was kind of the first part. There's some broader examples. And the second part I wanted to take up prior to this session. So when COVID was happening, we all know there was mass panic. There was a lot of things happening. Our job was to look at everything that's happening around the world and try to distill something of relevance and coherence so that we could share once the lockdowns put into place. But that's not the new normal we think will stay after COVID. So we try to focus on the things that are taking shape now that we actually think will stay. And so what I'll share with you, my screen is just a few examples very quickly of what this looks like. Because our geographic definition of Asia and Asia Pacific is from Iran to Fiji. So it's a wildly diverse group of countries. But instead of sharing this written document with you, what I instead created was, I wanted to share with you, this is fundamentally how this scan looked like. We covered things that were emerging that we believe could stay, and what COVID has sort of normalized or allowed an entry point across social, technology, environment, economic, political aspects. And some of the most ones that you might find interesting would be, for example, how COVID has allowed many governments in the region and abroad to normalize surveillance. And how this scan maybe differs, because we cater to such wide countries, is instead of, we offered the scan, this is what's happening, here are some links of news articles or research that sort of back this. But more importantly, we want to ask you prompts, homeschooling experiment in the world. We also know the fallout of that largest experiment across the world, very, very purely in March, what's happening right now. That's it. That was the value. We wanted to sort of distill information. One of what you're realizing, what we didn't have was anything in the policy realm or the values realm. And that's because policies don't just happen overnight. And I think this goes back to one of those questions about how fast does policy react? Also, values of social values don't change overnight, but they do start to take shape in small increments. And so the next step, 1 month later, is that we actually then mapped, and I'm happy to share this as well, 11 bold policy moves that were triggered by COVID around the world. So what are governments doing to which governments actually put forward brand new policy that as a direct response from COVID? And the reason they're bold is because in this time of COVID, where it's much easier for us to sort of maybe double down and make policy moves that support the status quo, which is fuel-based economies to resuscitate our, our jobs and our sort of very much flailing economies. These bold policy moves were actually about being pro-SDG. They all supported the alternative, which is how can we still make SDGs possible in this time where we are fundamentally feeling extremely vulnerable as governments. And so some of these bold policy moves, which I then also visualized for you, spanned across all these different sectors. These are some of the bold policy moves just in the last month between March and April that we saw happen around the world. For example, we have the Australian government, New Zealand government being the first government in the world to actually make tactical urbanism an official government policy. So how can we quickly convert roads into bike lanes with very little funding required? How can we experiment very quickly with tactical urbanism? We also have things like Amsterdam being one of the first certain municipalities to adopt donut-based economic models. So looking at actually planetary boundaries as a fundamental way of making decisions post-COVID. We also had the New York governor actually creating a task force with regional counterparts called Reimagine New York, which is about how do we actually fundamentally, after COVID, completely change the way we do housing policy, transportation, the use of technology. So these are actually incredibly sound, resilient, and searched for 10 really interesting and inclusive citizen moves that were COVID triggered. And just like with the policy, our angle was who is still supporting SDG? The angle we took when we were trying to create this list of citizen moves, where the civil society moved in when the government could not or would not in the Asia Pacific region, was from the angle of where are citizens intervening that is actually systemic. So not just immediate response, but actually looking at creating a system shift. So an example of that would be, for example, in Bhutan, we're seeing maker spaces around the world use 3D printers to generate PPE, right? Masks and other needs of hospitals. What maker spaces in Bhutan are doing is they're actually working with the entire Bhutanese healthcare system to map everything that the Bhutanese healthcare system imports as supplies. And then saying, out of all of these things that you import, here are all the things that actually domestic maker spaces can now make for you. Not just PPE, but all the other things that are also not urgent. So that after COVID, maybe we can have a much more shock-proof and resilient healthcare system from supply chain shocks and breaks. So that's looking at the whole healthcare system, not just immediate needs surfacing from COVID. So those are some of the citizen moves that we tried to highlight. And lastly, what I wanted to share is, we can do scans, but one of the biggest values of Foresight is actually looking at impacts. And that's where policymaking really comes into play. This is some work I did in partnership with our gender lead for one of our country offices in the region, looking at what are direct first, second, third order impacts of just physical distancing as it relates to gender violence. And what the fundamental end goal of this is actually that the colors in the light yellow at the end. They're actually things that have not happened yet, but based on maybe thinking about this happened, so this happened, and this triggers this. The yellow is actually third order implications of something that has been put into place by a government now, which is social distancing, requirements that actually might fundamentally shift or provide an opportunity for gender-based violence as a movement. And this is everything good from bad to bad. For example, it's quite possible if lockdowns continue for a very long amount of time, that we could actually damage and normalize household violence for a very young generation because they're going to see it on such a consistent basis. So that's taking a step back for an entire movement that has actually tried to really move past. Another thing that's possible that could happen that is up for governments to maybe take advantage of as an opportunity is how can actually unlikely partnerships emerge between governments and private sector to address gender-based violence because of some of the other things that we have mapped in the second order implications. So what I'm sharing with you is just very, very simple tools that you can actually do. And this was done in just 35 minutes with our gender lead, just saying this happens. You have physical distancing, which leads to work from home, but it also leads to closure of schools. It also leads to the closure of entertainment. What that leads to is actually imposing very lengthy intimacy of families, which can also be coupled with frustration because of loss of jobs. So this way of thinking about impacts allows you to arrive at opportunity spaces that haven't even happened. And this is where policy can intervene using foresight as a tool. I did a similar exercise. Sorry.
Yeah, Patishka, I'll have to cut you off just because I have a 3:30 forum that I am sharing.
Sure.
And, but this is I've hesitated because everything you're showing is fascinating. But this is going to be an ongoing hearing, and we'd love to have you back.
Absolutely. I just wanted to share something, so I'm happy to actually end by closing on two things, which is actually COVID allows us to do development very differently. It allows you to actually fundamentally look at not reinforcing the power dynamics and limiting beliefs that have held us back in the past, and also allows us as policymakers to not just introduce something that's new and emergent because it's simply emergent, but because of the paradigm that it represents. So with that, I apologize for taking so long, and I'm very, very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. I have to end this. Ideally, I wanted to have question and answers. My colleagues might have some, but I have a 3:30 forum that most of my colleagues are also attending, and some senators are already there. And I'm chairing that forum. So just like what we would do in a normal hearing, I do have staff on base, and the hearing is ended as of when I finish speaking. But you can talk to each other in the same way you would talk to each other in a physical environment by approaching each other. I know Professor Brillantes had a question, and you can go ahead, but the hearing has to be suspended as of now to allow me to go to the next hearing. And I will invite all of you back, whoever wants to come back to the next hearing, because we're going to tackle this some more. I just want to thank all the speakers for your valuable input. And to my other colleagues, like Senator Bato, see you in the next digital meeting. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have one question for Singh Prateksha, if that's okay. I'm Saku Koskinen from Futures Platform from Finland. Hi, nice to meet you. A really interesting illustration you have there. Have you used some specific tool to do this visualization, or is this how is it done? Just out of interest, it looks really interesting.
I just used Miro.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Got it. So that's the system. Yeah.
Yep. Because we were having virtual meetings, I just did this on a call with our gender team.
Perfect. And the idea is obviously to show the interconnections, isn't it, between phenomena events. How do you draw conclusions or cohesion out of this? Because that would be really interesting.
So what I did, this is my somewhat like variation of a method, but I color coded all the different angles that we look at. So let me see if I can zoom in very quickly.
Yeah.
So let me see. So for example, you're seeing that I color coded the different ways.
Yes.
And I actually started to try to draw interconnections whenever there was a first or second order impact happening that I knew was related to something else.
Yeah.
I color coded it using the same code of the sector. If there's a tech thing, I color coded it blue because tech was blue. Same for policy or regulation. The lockdown or curfew was a regulation. So that was a second order implication coming in here that still is playing into this gender-based violence map that I was drawing out with her.
Very good. Thank you. This I understand completely. This is really interesting because we are obviously developing a technical platform for Foresight, and all these kind of ways of thinking, visualizing the impact analysis is really important. So very good. It'd be great to maybe have a word with you at some point in the future. So thank you for this.
And one of the things I will just say to this, the reason we were doing this was a particular country office that wanted to look at gender-based violence.
Yes.
When we were doing our scans, we kept them very generic, but we kept them grounded in the examples of the countries we were seeing them in. But then this impact map has to be done by every country, because how work
Yes.
from home plays out in every country is different. There's
Yep.
different cultural implications, regulatory implications, different infrastructure and access. So
Yeah.
that was one of the ways this was done specific for a specific country office, actually.
Very good. Thank you for sharing this. So I
Yeah.
gotta go as well, but I hope to talk to you in the future as well. And thank you,
Sounds
everybody.
great.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Bye.
Happy to answer any other questions that anybody else might still.
Hi,